have this question asked me all the time where people are like, oh my God, I have a terrible diet. How long is it going to take me to get my diet back to where it's actually having an effect on my immune system? 2 days. This is your chance to figure out how you're going to cook healthy for yourself, because it's all there. Everybody's taking the unhealthy food because they think they have to make it last for 2 weeks. And all the vegetables are there. They are fantastic for getting your immune system going. There's actually systematic reviews showing that these short little things that you do increase the amount of salivary IgA, which we know can fight this virus.
Thanks for tuning in. I got Dr. Heather Zwickey here, who is at the National University of Natural Medicine with me. She got her Ph.D. in Immunology and Microbiology, and she teaches clinical immunology, and she is a wealth of information. And I wanted to bring on her expertise to speak with all of you today. So Heather, thank you for being here. Can you give my audience a little bit of background about you before we get started?
Sure. I think one of the reasons that people have been seeking me out right now is that my PhD was actually in immunology and microbiology, specifically looking at infectious disease. I was working on a vaccine for tuberculosis. I was working on how we would actually get tuberculosis to be recognized by the immune system, but also had some other interesting infectious disease experiences while I was in graduate school. And then, as you mentioned, I went on to Yale and was working on cancer vaccines, specifically dendritic cell-based cancer vaccines, and looking at whether or not those vaccines would stimulate autoimmune diseases. And I know that's something else that a lot of people are really worried about right now is this virus going to, send their autoimmune disease off into a tizzy? So we can talk about that as well. About 2002, I was recruited to the National University of Natural Medicine, where I launched the Helfgott Research Institute to look at natural therapies and their effects on the immune system. And then ultimately ended up helping to found the graduate program at NUNM. So I've been there for almost 20 years now. Okay. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have for me.
Awesome. Well, you are absolutely one of my favorite teachers, very close friends. So thank you. I really appreciate you and everything you've done for our profession to really elevate it in terms of evidence-based medicine, in terms of natural modalities, which I know many people have lots of questions about right now. And, one of the things I wanted to start with right now is just kind of where are we at right now with coronavirus, and how is COVID-19 different than other coronaviruses that we've dealt with in the past?
Yeah, it's a great question. So where are we at right now? We are at a place right now where new information is coming out every single day, in fact, hourly, on the science of this particular virus. We finally have a grasp on what's going on clinically with other countries, and we're being able to apply that to what we're doing here. This virus is different than other coronaviruses, and it's different for a few different reasons. The first major reason is this virus binds to the ACE2 protein, which is usually going to be binding to angiotensin 2. So most people have heard of ACE2 if they've heard of ACE inhibitors. So cardiovascular disease, we often put people on ACE inhibitors, and this is that protein that we end up targeting. So we usually think of it in the cardiovascular system, but it turns out that protein is expressed all over the body. And one place it's expressed a lot is in the lungs. So that's why this virus can target the lungs, but it's also expressed in the GI tract, which is why we know that some people get GI symptoms. It's also expressed in the brain and central nervous system. So some people are having brain effects or central nervous system effects with this virus. It's expressed in testes. So it may end up being more severe in males. And we'll probably not know that until we know more of the statistics. However, the fact that it binds to that receptor is just one thing. This virus has 2 virulence factors. Now, the other coronaviruses like MERS and SARS have 1 active virulence factor. And the reality of a virulence factor is it's going to make the virus stronger. This particular virus with its 2 virulence factors has one of the virulence factors activating a particular protein in the immune system, well, a group of proteins. proteins called an inflammasome. And an inflammasome is when we look at a bunch of proteins that are all involved in inflammation and we group them together. So we call that an inflammasome. For this particular virus, it's activating a specific inflammasome that causes huge amounts of inflammation in the lungs. And that inflammation causes edema or fluid to come into the lungs, which means then people have a hard time breathing. So when you're hearing about folks who may be self-diagnosing because they're having difficulty breathing, that's what's going on, is the virus is causing fluid to come into the lungs through an inflammasome. Mm. Do you want to ask another question?
Yeah. So with that too, what is making this so deadly? Is it that the inflammasome is activated and it's just they're not able to clear mucus? So I've heard it's a very deep congestion in the lungs and the lobar lung area of the lungs, so you can't get it out? Or is it more of this picture of cytokine storm? There's this word that's being thrown out a little bit. So I wanted you to touch base on what is a cytokine storm and just talk a little bit about what that is.
Okay, there's actually two reasons that's making this more deadly. One is the cytokine storm and the other is pneumonia. So one possibility is that people get this virus, they get pneumonia, and they're unable to bring oxygenated air into their body. And when they can't do that, then their blood pressure raises in order to try to increase oxygenation in the blood, and it puts more pressure on their kidneys and more pressure on other organs, and they end up with organ failure. So that's one way that people are dying. The other way that people are talking about right now is this concept of a cytokine storm. So we've known about cytokine storms for a long time. Probably the first really good description of a cytokine storm was toxic shock syndrome, where women were mounting a response to the bacteria that was in tampons. But potato salad can give you a cytokine storm from Staph aureus. What a cytokine storm is when a toxin produced by a bacteria or a virulence factor produced by a virus causes a large amount of cytokine to be secreted, and it can't be turned off. So a lot of cytokine all at once. Historically, we would say that 2 to 20% of your T cells all got activated at the same time, and it would cause people to bleed out, essentially. What's happening with this virus is the particular cytokine that's being activated is called interleukin-1 beta, and it's getting turned on and it's not getting turned off. So the virus seems to be interfering with the regulation of that particular gene.
Very great explanation of that. So when people are thinking about, so there's being this overproduction of interleukin beta, people are always wondering, 1 beta, is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, 1 beta. So people want to know, like, okay, so this is what's happening. They have that information, but what can I do about it? You talked about the aspect of the inflammasome being activated. And I did see that there was the World Health Organization just published confirming that to avoid ibuprofen because it's a COX-2 inhibitor. So, we have natural alternatives in medicine too, stuff like curcumin, and we have stuff like ginger, and they work on the nuclear factor kappa beta pathway. Are these, I just want to get, what's your thoughts on the ibuprofen and then like some of these natural alternatives in our natural toolkit? Is this to be used with caution as well?
Yeah, so first ibuprofen. Yes, I know that the US government has been reluctant to say don't take ibuprofen, and I'm not quite sure why, because there's good physiological evidence to suggest that ibuprofen would be problematic in that it does interfere with COX-2, right? It's called a COX-2 inhibitor for a reason, and the cyclooxygenase enzymes that it inhibits are in the same pathway that this virus is attacking. So we have alternatives, use alternatives. Don't take ibuprofen, take acetaminophen instead. It does cause a headache. The virus does cause a headache. So people are wanting to take something to reduce fever and reduce their headache, and acetaminophen is just going to be better right now. The second aspect is, we have natural products that do target this inflammasome. It's a lot of the same anti-inflammatories that people have heard of. So You mentioned turmeric and ginger, and those definitely are two proteins that can target the NLRP3 inflammasome, which is what it's called. But there's a whole family of biological plants that can target this inflammasome, because this inflammasome can be inhibited by a particular ingredient called rosmarinic acid. And rosmarinic acid, named after rosemary, right? So it's in rosemary, but it's also in basil, it's in sage, it's in lemon balm, it's in a lot of the mint family, and it's even in cannabis. However, to get rosmarinic acid out of cannabis, you need high temperatures and long extraction periods. So most people don't go for rosmarinic acid from cannabis, but large quantities in things like rosemary and basil. So can we, I mean, you do food, Tyler. This is perfect for you, right? Let's eat Italian, right? Here we go.
So I think that's another thing just to clarify too, because in one aspect, there's like, how can I support my immune system versus like strengthening or stimulating or modulating? Can you just talk about some of those different terms that are kind of being used and thrown around, and like, when people want to feel empowered in what they can do, I mean, I really think it just comes back to eating more whole, unadulterated, real foods, nutrient dense, loaded with vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals that are a lot of these cofactors that are used in a lot of enzymatic pathways and also support our endogenous antioxidant defense system. So can you just speak a little bit about kind of like how food could play a role in actually modulating or supporting the immune system in particular?
Yeah, so food is critical to the health of your immune system. We know that 80% of your immune system is in your gut, and it's in your gut because you're exposing yourself to food every day and because that's where your microbiome is. So if your immune system is in your gut, then you want to feed the microbes in your gut really well in order to make your immune system the best functioning immune system it can be. That's where you're going to see things like prebiotics being really important. I think of Jerusalem artichoke, I think onions, garlic, any sort of fibrous food, right? So good fibrous food. But also probiotics. Do we know that probiotics are going to have any impact on a COVID-19 infection? No, we don't. No research has been done. But what we do know is that at least for some of the probiotics that are on the market right now with lactobacillus and bifidobacterium strains in them, that they are very positive for your immune system. So why? Well, the microbes in your gut produce a bunch of products, microbial products is probably the best word to not confuse people. And those products, specifically the short chain fatty acids, are really good at helping your immune system create a particular type of cell called a Treg cell. Treg cells are responsible for shutting down the immune system when the immune system is going awry. So if what we're seeing with people is that this inflammasome is getting activated and they're having a cytokine storm, the way you shut down a cytokine storm is you increase your Tregs. Why wouldn't you have a good population of Tregs? Well, if you have a crappy diet, you're not going to have a good population of Tregs, right? Because these are the foods that are feeding your Tregs. So I have this question asked me all the time where people are like, oh my God, I have a terrible diet. How long is it going to take me to get my diet back to where it's actually having an effect on my immune system? 2 days.
2 days.
2 days. So just 2 days of eating well, we show an increase in butyrate, which is the particular chemical we want to improve your Tregs. So 2 days, I think everybody can do that, right? Yeah. The other thing is I was at the grocery store this morning and I noticed that all of the ramen was gone. All of the canned foods were gone. The dairy was gone. And the vegetable part was totally like untouched. And I had my pick of everything in the grocery store, right? So I guess what I would say is this is your chance to figure out how you're going to cook healthy for yourself because it's all there. Everybody's taking the unhealthy food because they think they have to make it last for 2 weeks. And all the vegetables are there. They are fantastic for getting your immune system going.
So prebiotics, again, all those fibrous plant-based foods, like you mentioned, the Jerusalem artichoke, the asparagus.
Mushrooms. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have the probiotics. And so I'm sure people are going to be like, which, supplement do I take too? But I always try to remind people whole food first, because I know there's prebiotic supplements on the market too. And so, I really love kimchi. That's something that I will do all the time. And sauerkraut, and a kefir or a yogurt, like a coconut yogurt too.
Yep.
Are there any foods in particular? I mean, I'm thinking fiber devoid, nutrient poor foods are just going to be deleterious to the immune system, but are there any that you know of in particular that may be making you more prone to infection in a way?
Yeah, actually, we know that artificial sweeteners are terrible for your microbiome. So that's one thing I would absolutely stay away from. Anything with an artificial sweetener, no good.
Sucralose, neotame, all those kind of things.
Yeah, Splenda, etc. Of course, now they're all going to come after us, aren't they? We've just named brands. Anyway, the data is pretty clear. Stay away from the artificial sweeteners. So if you're going to sweeten, and I would stay away from high fructose corn syrup as well. And I know that's something that you share. If I were going to use a sweetener, I'm going to use maple syrup. I'm going to use agave, honey, or stevia, which actually lowers blood sugar and is good for your microbes. The other thing to think about, especially if you're going for canned foods, is, we managed to take BPA out of our canned foods now, and BPA was terrible for your immune system, but we've replaced it with a polyvinyl, and there's no evidence that polyvinyl is any better than BPA was. So if you can stay away from canned foods, it's probably better for you.
Yeah.
And again, I know that many of your listeners are the folks who would never touch a canned food anyway, but I'm just going to throw that out there because desperate times, people start going for desperate measures. So yeah, so those are the things that immediately come to mind with stuff to stay away from.
Absolutely. You'd mentioned about blood sugar, and there's, been in the media too on people. So they talked about hypertension, so high blood pressure, but also people with diabetes, particularly males as well, older age. We're talking about kind of like what's the risk factor of actually contracting COVID-19. Have you looked into why people with diabetes may be more likely to contract a virus such as COVID-19?
We don't know why contract. And I don't know that it's going to be a contraction issue. I mean, I think that a whole lot of people have or have had COVID-19 and haven't been tested because they haven't had severe disease. But why do diabetics get sick with COVID-19? One of the things we see with diabetes is an increase in inflammation. In other words, their inflammasome is already turned on. And now if this particular virus ramps it up, you could understand why they might get sicker than other people would. So we know with high blood sugar that it's causing inflammation, and this inflammasome that's being activated by NF-kappa B, as you mentioned earlier, is already ramped up. So this is going to be true then for anyone with an inflammatory disease, right? If you already have an inflammatory disease where this inflammasome is high, then you're probably going to struggle more with the symptoms than other people will.
Great point. I did want to jump the conversation and talk a little bit more about your bread and butter around immunology, because there's a bunch of people that are, freaking out in a way. And I think it's important to spread positive information and for people to be informed, but what do we do with that information? And I think it's got us all a little bit in a frenzy, but right now there's a lot of talk about elderberry syrup and how it can be beneficial and its antiviral benefits for influenza and H1N1, but we don't know enough about corona in particular, but people are worried about that cytokine storm that you talked about. My original question to this was, with anything that we learn in school with herbs, certain foods, it's always, who is this for? Because it needs to be, individualized. So there are people that may have different comorbidities. They may have an autoimmune condition, such as psoriasis or Hashimoto's. They may be dealing with mold, or they have Lyme disease. I just wanted you to break down a little bit, what is a Th1 response versus a Th2? Why would we be eliciting a Th1 response in response to a virus? And talk a little bit about some of these different populations. I know it's a big question.
Yeah, it's like a 2-hour question. Okay, so let's see what we can do here. First of all, let's talk about elderberry and cytokine storms. So if you have an underlying inflammatory condition, elderberry and some other herbs have been shown to increase a pro-inflammatory cytokine response. It's one of the reasons they're good for virus, because we actually know that increasing your pro-inflammatory response early in infection is going to shorten the length of the infection. Problem with that is the pro-inflammatory cytokines, the 3 pro-inflammatory cytokines that we talk about all the time, are interleukin-1, which is one targeted by this virus, interleukin-6, and TNF-alpha. And all of those cytokines cause sickness behaviors. Interleukin-1 is really good at making you tired and making you feel malaised and kind of just knocking you out. Interleukin-6 is good at making you anxious. And TNF-alpha is good at making you kind of aggressive and hostile. All right, now let's look at what happens if you give somebody elderberry and they have an underlying inflammatory condition. They already are making IL-1 and elderberry increases their IL-1, they're going to be more tired. They're going to be more malaised. So if you give elderberry to somebody who has IL-1 already, it's not causing a cytokine storm, but they may feel worse. Likewise, with IL-6, elderberry isn't known to increase IL-6. However, there are herbs that can increase IL-6. And if you give that particular herb to somebody who's already anxious, it can make their anxiety worse, right? So this is why we say we want to tailor herbal medicine to the individual, because if we know that you have a particular background of inflammation, we can pick the right herb that is best for you. And that's, I think, the beauty of natural medicine. Mm-hmm. Now, next question, basic immune response, okay? So basic immune response, you get exposed to something, and for the first 8 hours to 24 hours roughly, you have what's called an inflammatory response. And this is when you make interleukin-1, interleukin-6, TNF-alpha. This is when you make those pro-inflammatory cytokines. And I say this specifically because I know that now that I've mentioned rosmarinic acid and all of the herbs that affect it, somebody out there is going to go and start, hog wild taking these herbs. You have to have an inflammatory response in order to fight the virus. Mm-hmm. So if you take too much, you're shutting down inflammation and you're just going to make your infection worse.
I think that's so important, though, that you clarify that, because that acute mediated inflammation is absolutely necessary. And
it's required. Yeah.
That long-term chronic inflammatory response that goes unresolved, that is typically a hallmark of a lot of disease pathogenesis that we're looking at all these other anti-inflammatory compounds for.
Exactly. So when you're trying to prevent infection, you're not shooting for taking, the mint family and those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. Then you're looking at some of the antivirals like elderberry or echinacea. Or you might be looking at astragalus, golden seal, those sorts of things we think about for prevention. Now, if you look at the immune response, so we go through inflammation, and the next thing to kick in is we're going to start to activate the specific immune system. And in the specific immune system, we want a response that's called a Th1 response in order to fight a virus. It's the response we make to viruses and bacteria that resolves them. You can make a Th2 response to a virus or bacteria, but it doesn't typically resolve the infection very well. Mm-hmm. So this Th1 response is characterized by interferon gamma, which is another particular cytokine, and that can activate antibodies, it can activate CD8 T cells, and that's going to be what tries to get this virus under control. Mm. For some people, that's the response that's not shutting down. They don't have enough Tregs to shut down that response when it should be over, and they go into this chronic inflammation. And that's when you would use things like herbs with rosmarinic acid. So we've kind of got 4 phases, because the last phase is that we're going to keep around some of those T cells in case we get exposed again. Mm-hmm. That's the basis for vaccines, right? That if we get exposed again, we've got these T cells that can respond. Mm-hmm. So here we are. We have inflammation, then we move into the specific immune response, then we move into resolving the response, and then we've got an immunological memory.
Yeah.
And we know in medicine that you're going to do different things for each phase of that response.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really like to, I just, one thing I was going to throw in is for food as medicine kind of thing, those long chain omega-3 fatty acids from
Mhm.
wild fish, like sardines and herring, results in E series and D series resolvins and protectins, which help resolve, it's like lipid mediated resolution of inflammation in that resolving aspect.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that we know people are deficient in, right? We know people are deficient in their omega-3s, and it's another reason why they don't resolve.
Yeah. So, okay. So there's all those different phases of resolving that inflammation. And so this is kind of like that basic thing. So you talked about Th1, Th2, and then there's this polarization. Some people may be predisposed to higher Th2, higher Th1. Can you speak about which those are, and then how something that may, so like if someone were to get a virus, but they already have high Th1, what happens?
Yeah, good question. So Th1 is something that we associate with autoimmune disease. And people who have it's Th1 and another Th called Th17. When people have high Th1, what happens when they get an infection? They tend to have a flare in their autoimmune disease. So if you have a Th1 response already, likely it will make your Th1 response greater, and may cause you to flare. If you have a Th2 response, we associate Th2 responses with worms and parasites, but also with allergies. So if you have a Th2 response that is ongoing, it's usually harder to mount a Th1 response to a virus. So it's actually good news for that inflammasome, because it's not likely you're going to have a huge inflammatory reaction, but it's also going to take you a lot longer to resolve the infection if you're Th2 dominant. So if you have allergies, it's going to take longer to resolve the infection. Now, that being said, this infection is hard to resolve anyway, simply because we've never seen it before. And the first time you're responding to a new virus or bacteria usually takes about 2 weeks. And that's what we're seeing, right? We're seeing 14 days for the average person to have a full response. The second time you respond to something, now it's only taking a week. And by the third time, it's taking 2 or 3 days. And then we've all heard of the 24-hour flu. That's circulated so many times, and you've been exposed so many times that it takes 24 hours, you respond, and you're healthy. So we're at a place where coronavirus, because it's the first time, where we're seeing a full 2-week response with the average person. Now, this is where, again, it's possible that herbs can shorten that time. Right? So that's what we see with things like echinacea, is that they don't actually decrease the number of times that you might get the flu, but it decreases the amount of time it takes you to respond and resolve something like flu.
Just speak a little bit on like how echinacea is doing that. How is it?
Yeah, it's ramping up the pro-inflammatory cytokines in the first part of an infection. So echinacea is what we call an adaptogenic herb. So it actually responds during multiple parts of the immune response. And in that pro-inflammatory phase, it increases some of the pro-inflammatory cytokines. So yes, it will make you feel worse. It doesn't do as much in the Th1 response, but it does increase T regulatory cells, so it helps you resolve the infection. So you've got a faster lead up time, and you've got a faster resolution, such that you actually resolve the infection much faster. That usually what they're seeing is echinacea is having the time.
What type of, I know we use different parts in naturopathic medicine in terms of herbs and herbalists as well. Is this the root? Is this the aerial parts? Is it, well, do you know specifically what parts are used for this specifically?
Yeah, with echinacea, it's not root. But yeah, I don't remember because there's so many studies on so many different parts of the plant. I can't tell you which ones are which. Sorry.
Yeah. No. Okay. So we talked about elderberry. We talked about echinacea. Is there any other herbs that have been studied and have literature to suggest their benefits in terms of modulating the immune system?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Lots and lots. Yeah.
What are some of those that come to mind?
So for for me, for my particular strategy, and this is not for COVID-19, this is for any upper respiratory infection, I think using some of the antivirals that will also shorten length of infection early for prevention. So I think of astragalus, I think of echinacea, Oregon grapefruit, golden seal, elderberry. Those are kind of my go-to for prevention. Then when you move into an infection, then I'm thinking bigger, like hit it with the hammer sort of thing. I wouldn't do that for this infection personally, but for a lot of viral infections at that point, I moved to things like oregano oil and basil, and some of the, like, these things are strong. Like if you've ever had oregano oil, you will burp it for days after, right? So this is like, you can't resolve your infection, bam, hit it with oregano oil. Yeah.
Well, you've been mentioning just a lot of culinary herbs too, with the basil, oregano, thyme, and you talked about rosemary. So, just thinking like, how can you incorporate these foods too into everyday cooking? I can only see it adding benefit but no harm. It can only help.
That's
right?
correct. Yeah. So again, as we're talking about these, like, there's a huge difference between supplementing with them and cooking with them, in that if you're supplementing with them, you can be shutting down or turning on pathways, right? Whereas if you're cooking with them, you're supporting, you're modulating, and you're doing it in a way that your body can handle gently. So like if you're working with kids, I don't like to supplement the kids, but I like to cook the food with the herbs in them for the kids, right?
Absolutely. Why is this not affecting kids as much so far as compared to the elder population?
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation. Probably the best evidence right now has to do with melatonin. The younger you are, the more melatonin you make. And you know that melatonin is the enzyme that helps put you to sleep. So kids are making like 300 milligrams, not milligrams, 300 picograms of melatonin per night. And as you age, yeah, as you age, let's get a factor of six or 1,000 there. That wouldn't be good. As you age, your melatonin decreases. So the less melatonin you have, the more likely you are to get this infection. Now, why would melatonin matter? Melatonin, it turns out, is one of our natural enzymes that shuts down this particular inflammasome. So kids could be exposed but not have any inflammation because of the amount of melatonin they're making. That's a correlative study, right? Like there's no evidence at this point that therapeutically giving anybody melatonin is going to be helpful. So I don't want people to rush out and start taking mass doses of melatonin. Also remember that the melatonin that people take as a supplement to go to sleep is already 1,000-fold more than what your body's making. So you're really at that long end of the curve. And yeah, so we don't know therapeutically if melatonin is going to work, but that appears to be at least one component with the kids. Now, there's other things that change over time, right? So we've got one great correlation, but it could be any number of hormones or neurotransmitters that change with time as well.
Absolutely. I mean, you bring up a great point too, and I kind of just want to address the important aspect of sleep. And so when you think about melatonin, it's an anti-inflammatory hormone and an antioxidant, and sleep is one of the best things we can do to support our immune system, and it's free. We all have that capacity unless we are diagnosed with unfortunate insomnia of some sort. But during this time, how important is it that we are really prioritizing our sleep and improving sleep hygiene?
Very, very important. So it's not just melatonin. So we know that melatonin puts you to sleep and GABA keeps you asleep. GABA also supports the regulation of that particular inflammasome. So sleeping through the night is as important as getting to sleep at night. So if people aren't sleeping, working on sleep hygiene, or I'm not going to recommend taking a pharmaceutical sleep med, because you often don't get the same production of melatonin and GABA if you're taking a pharmaceutical. You really have to trigger your body to do it for itself. But yeah, sleep is incredible. The other thing is you are required to sleep in order to have a good population of Tregs. So resolving that infection is going to be critical, and only way you do that is through sleep.
Amazing. I never put that connection together, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
But, Heather, there's a lot of fear and anxiety right now around COVID-19, which I could also assume is making it hard for people to sleep and to stay asleep. And so something that came to mind too is how, we have this toolkit in terms of naturopathic medicine. I just thought of different nervines and stuff like that and different herbs that we, have in our toolkit that, can really, help support people that are feeling anxious, along with, just type of like breathing and meditation and just, Epsom salt baths and foam rolling. I mean, there's just so much I can think of that we can do to really support people, and why I think that, during this time, there's so much that I believe naturopathic doctors can offer to people for kind of just supports around this time.
Completely agree. There is no need to panic. Like there just isn't. It's be responsible. Yes. Take care of yourself, take care of your body, and be good to your family and your friends. Yes. But panic, no. Because all that panic is doing is raising your cortisol levels. And when your cortisol goes up, your immune system changes its location. It moves to the periphery and it gets ready for fight or flight. And at that point, you're not getting attacked by a lion this time. This is an infection. We don't want your immune system out in your skin. We want it in your upper respiratory tract and in your gut. So lowering your cortisol is absolutely critical. Now, you mentioned a couple of great things to do. As someone who has struggled to be a meditator, and I try, and I'm not a good meditator, I would also say that it can be as simple as closing your eyes for 5 seconds and thinking about something that you love, walking outside and just being grateful for air and trees and birds and spring. Like, those little things may not seem to you like they're doing anything, but they absolutely impact your immune system. There's actually systematic reviews showing that these short little things that you do increase the amount of salivary IgA, which we know can fight this virus. Like, we know that if you have good salivary IgA, you're going to have the terrain that can keep this thing under control. So
your soldier cells that are ready to.
Exactly.
Yep. So you guys heard it from Dr. Zwickey right there. The last thing I wanted to kind of touch base on, because everyone's asking about, other than herbs, supplements, what do I need to do? And I'm always just like, foods first. It always comes from whole foods. Food is a package. It works in synergy. But what are maybe some certain vitamins or minerals or cofactors that you have seen to actually have evidence to support that they are beneficial for the immune system?
Yeah, so probably the number one thing for the immune system is going to be vitamin D. And I know that there's a rumor circulating right now on whether vitamin D increases that ACE2 receptor and therefore may increase infection. But I've hunted for the literature and I'm not seeing it. So if you happen to run across that information, yeah, we know that 95% of Americans are low in vitamin D. And part of that is going to be their vitamin D receptors. There's some receptor polymorphism so that some people don't absorb vitamin D as well as others, but vitamin D is critical to the health of your immune system. So that's the first thing. Vitamin A, equally critical, and critical to having antiviral infections. Remember that both D and A you can take too much. So
That's because they're fat soluble, right?
Yeah, they're fat soluble and they'll be stored in your fat. You aren't going to pee them out. So if you take too much, you're going to start feeling pretty bad. So just be cognizant of that.
Where's the best place? Can you also just kind of speak to vitamin D, like the sunlight or certain foods or something?
We wish. Right? We wish we could get enough vitamin D from sunlight. But there was an interesting study that came out of Boston, I don't know, it's probably 15 years ago now, where they actually took a bunch of their students, male, put them up on the roof and had them take their shirts off to try to absorb as much vitamin D as they could from the sun on an average day. And with the angle of the sun, if you live in a northern latitude, you are not going to get enough vitamin D from the sun. And the reality is, if you live in a southern latitude, you're probably inside an air conditioning and you're not going to get enough vitamin D just because you don't have enough skin exposure. And if you do have enough skin exposure, it means you probably didn't put on your sunscreen. And so your dermatologist is going to be mad. So you're probably going to just not get enough vitamin D from sun. I think that's just reality, right? So then you say, well, what other places can you get vitamin D? Well, you can get it from milk, but I'm personally not a huge dairy fan. So I steer people away from vitamin D in milk, and I just go straight up for a supplement. And what I usually do is the emulsified supplements. So I can just put a couple of drops in a smoothie of vitamin D and know that I'm going to get the vitamin D I need for a day.
Awesome. Yeah, I know that there is some vitamin D in certain types of mushrooms, but
Mushrooms,
it's a different type of vitamin D compared to the active, the ergocalciferol. And then also liver. I'm a big fan of kind of offal and organ meats just because of how nutrient dense they are.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard that they do have some amounts of vitamin D, but
They do.
supplementing is definitely important. I just got my labs done 2 weeks ago. I was at 51.
Woohoo, I'm at 54.
Yes, so I was like boosting those defenses. So
That's right. So
okay.
I also want to say vitamin C. And I want to say vitamin C because we know ascorbic acid is fantastic for reactive oxygen species, and the overproduction of reactive oxygen species that happens in this particular infection is probably going to help be mediated by vitamin C. And vitamin C is the easy one because if you take too much, you pee it out.
Yep.
So just take vitamin C as well.
Yeah, but so how often? I heard Dr. Anderson talking about like 1,000 or like 1 gram with meals. You could even do it every hour or something like that. But I mean, it was interesting that I guess in Shanghai they've been doing intravenous vitamin C.
Yep.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, and actually, I know of a few clinics both in Portland and in California who are doing IV vitamin C too. So, vitamin C. If you're taking it orally, you get much more than 10 grams a day, you're going to have loose stools. And if you're getting it in multiple sources, you might even reduce that to like 3 grams a day. And yeah, but the other thing that you can do is you can get IV vitamin D or vitamin C, sorry, IV ascorbic acid. And then what they do is they're usually giving 50 to 30 grams a day. And this is good if you, again, already have an inflammatory disease and you're trying to reduce inflammation before you might be exposed. If you don't have an inflammatory disease, there's probably no reason to get IV vitamin C right now.
Very good, very good. The last thing I wanted to ask you, and for those that don't know, one of the best places to find vitamin C is plant-based foods. I mean, I think you can only find it in plant-based foods. You can find it in nose-to-tail approach and eating organ meats. There's small amounts of vitamin C, I believe, but your citrus fruits, bell peppers, dark leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, all those are going to be really rich in vitamin C. And so I advocate for eating all those fruits and vegetables for that reason. But
I want to say something about that too.
Sure.
Same with vitamin A. We think colorful, think, tomatoes and carrots and that sort of thing. But the other thing to remember is that the strains of fruits and vegetables that we have that are hybrids often do not contain the same vitamin levels as the heritage strains. So if you have the chance to, get a heritage orange, yes, it's smaller, but it has a whole lot more vitamin A and vitamin C than those big monster oranges that are larger than grapefruit. It's just the strains contain more of the enzymes to create the vitamins.
Got it. Very good. The last thing I wanted to ask you is just, what do we know now? I know that there's been works on creating a vaccination for the coronavirus, and I know that it's, we're talking about, it's already mutated, and by the time we actually create one, is it going to mutate again? Where are we at right now? What can you speak to on that with your expertise?
Yeah, so from a public health perspective, a vaccine is really important. And we know that yesterday they started vaccinating the first participants in a clinical trial for a vaccine in Seattle. Here's what we know. We know that because this virus appears to be as mutable or more mutable than flu, a single vaccine for a long period of time, like we have with something like pertussis, is probably not going to be effective. It's probably going to be more like a flu vaccine where we have to vaccinate every year. There's also some question about whether or not this virus is leading to long-term immunity. Like, when you get an infection and then, as we've been talking about, it's shorter and it's shorter and it's shorter. There's a question whether this virus is actually stimulating a full immune response such that we get that whole response, which means that here's where that's coming from. There are physicians who were exposed to the virus in China in December who now in March don't have antibodies anymore. That's not expected. Yeah. So what that would mean is that they're not getting a long-term response. And if we don't get a long-term response, that means a vaccine won't be as effective, right? So it would mean that we may have to vaccinate twice per winter if we're only getting a 3-month response. And again, we just don't know where we are right now with this vaccine. Also remember that antibodies are not necessarily protective. It's T cells that are protective. Is it possible that those doctors don't have an antibody response, but they do have a T cell response? Entirely possible. We just don't know. So we're really in the infancy. But also remember with the vaccines, and this is why it's going to take a little while to get a vaccine, that the people who were injected yesterday with this experimental vaccine will know within 14 days whether or not they mount an immune response to it. But we won't know for a year about whether they have long-term immunity. Exactly.
Very interesting. And I heard too that they're now looking at treating kind of this novel approach to treating COVID-19 with anti-malarials.
Yes.
That too.
Yeah, so chloroquine, which is in anti-malarials, is disrupting the spike protein and the ACE protein so that they can't come together. Now, chloroquine is it's a fantastic anti-malarial, and it's could be great here, but also remember that it is horrible for your liver. So this is not something that you're going to want to take on a regular basis, right? This is something that you would take if you absolutely had to. Yeah. The herb where chloroquine comes from is Artemisia, also called wormwood. Mm-hmm. So I imagine that we will have an herbal remedy as well. And again, not something you want to take every day, right? Don't go out and buy all the Artemisia saying, I'm going to just dose myself with Artemisia, because again, you could kill your liver in the process. So let's not do that.
Great. The last thing I kind of just wanted to end with is for people that, in kind of summing this all up, people are a little bit worried and they're just like, what do I do? What are, I guess, your top 3 tips that maybe you're personally doing, or kind of just like that you would recommend just to make sure that you are best supported or ready for whatever's kind of being thrown our way?
Mm-hmm. So what do? I get outside, I breathe fresh air. Mm-hmm. Like, I think that's really important. I think that locking ourselves away is good for not increasing spread if you're close to people, but I live out in the country, so I can be outside. That's number 1. Number 2, I exercise. Exercise is good for your microbiome. It's good for your lungs. You want your lungs to be in good shape here. So actually making sure that you're getting some exercise every day. From a supplement perspective, I have my go-to supplements, and I'm not going to talk about them because they're mine. And I don't want to have a conflict of interest here. But I do have supplements that I take every day. And I also have, I take vitamin D every day. I take vitamin C every day. And B for that matter. Mm-hmm. So I'm making sure that, I'm taking those things. I don't take a probiotic. I'm somebody who doesn't do well with probiotics. I eat prebiotic. And the research that's come out in this last year with prebiotics is 30 servings of fruit and vegetables a week.
Wow. Really?
Okay. Now think about that. 30 servings. If you think a serving is a half cup, right? That's about 4 servings a day, 4 half-cup servings a day. So, I ask people, are you really getting 4 half? You probably are. Is the average person really getting
I'm like Barry Walls. I'm doing like 9 cups of vegetables a day. Yeah.
Exactly. You're probably fine. But the average person is not getting their 30 servings, like you ask the average person and they're like, oh yeah, I got the pizza sauce on my pizza. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
So really making sure during this period of time that you are doing all the things that we know are ideal for your body. And I'm sleeping. And it's interesting, I'm noticing that my family is sleeping more right now. Probably because of the stress, right?
Yeah.
That there's a stress just to being exposed to all of this news.
Yeah.
If you're going to sleep more, like trust your body.
Yeah.
And get that extra set of hours.
It's your body's telling you something. And I've kind of just haven't been
Absolutely.
setting an alarm. And it's interesting, the last 2 days, because I track my sleep with this sleep tracking app with
Mhm.
Aura. My deep sleep the other night was 3 hours and 17 minutes. And then last night was 2 hours and 50 minutes, which is rather high. I mean, I've had deep sleep like that score before, but I'm wondering, is it because of kind of just the extra tension and everything that's going on? Is it that I've spent 5+ hours outdoors the last 2 days each?
Mhm.
And it's just getting all of that sunlight, and that's kind of helping reset that circadian rhythm and just kind of getting me back on track with everything, and reducing that stress and stuff like that. So it's just been interesting. And so I do plan on going outside and going for an hour walk after this, and just kind of clearing my head and getting the fresh air, and cooking wholesome, nourishing foods. And I think this is a great time too for people that maybe don't have that much familiarity in the kitchen, to really buckle down and try to get more familiar on how they can create more meals from scratch and a lot more nutrient dense foods. And I think that's going to make a big difference for a lot of people.
I do too. And it's interesting. A friend of mine in California sent a picture of his local Trader Joe's, and everything had been completely cleaned out except the cauliflower pizza crust. I was like, great, perfect time for you to experiment with cauliflower pizza crust. Yesterday, I was in the grocery store for just a brief minute, and everything was cleared out except the gluten-free bread. Like, I was like, good. Now,
Yeah, the
not a
health stuff.
gluten-free thing.
I saw like the tolerant pasta. It's just like the one ingredient red lentil pasta, and I was like,
Oh, I love it.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's great,
love
100%
it.
organic stuff like that. Yeah, it's interesting, and I think at times like this too, it's important to take care of yourself, but just really, surround yourself with positivity, reach out to other people, lean on each other. I know that there's supposed to be that physical distancing, but doesn't mean that there needs to be social distancing. I think it's kind of like reframing that. So like physically, we're apart, but together, we can really get through this. And I think that's what a lot of people are looking for, is positivity and support right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So thank you so much, Heather, for your expertise and your contribution to this. I know a lot of people are going to really enjoy what you have to say. And if people want to connect with you, learn a little bit more about you and everything that you have to offer, where could they find more information about you?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I do have a LinkedIn, and that's where I tend to keep professional questions and articles and that sort of thing. I'm on Instagram, Zwickey, and my account doesn't tend to be as professional as yours. But when I do have things to say, I will post it there. So,
Awesome.
so that's another place you can find me.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Zwickey. It was so great chatting with you. Stay safe, stay healthy. And thank you again.
Yeah. Good luck, everyone.
Thanks.